let's move on to John, who's going to give our first paper about Star Trek.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So my presentation is basically a kind of a part of a project that I've been trying to explore, to think about. I'm interested in SETI as really a practice of imagination, not so much necessarily, although I am interested in what people are, trying to find. But and as I've thought about SETI, it seems to me to form a kind of, or be structured around an evolutionary eschatology that is based on the idea that there are intelligent species out there, and an intelligent species gets saved through technological and associated progress. And so I think within SETI, what has emerged is a kind of social imaginary that I use Star Trek as an example, but it comes from different areas of science fiction and certainly other things as well. But Star Trek is a really good example. And my basic argument is that there's a collection of socio-technical entities like scientists, fictional representations, ideological tropes, like things like the Old West and the frontier and this kind of thing. And they intertwine in the SETI context to form a coherent body of practice that's employed to justify and to legitimize scientific practices that are related to SETI. And so I began the presentation and the paper it's based on with this quote from Gene Roddenberry: "I believe in humanity. We are an incredible species. We're still just a child creature. We're still being nasty to each other, and all children go through those phases. We're growing up. We're moving into adolescence now. When we grow up, man, we're going to be something." And this conveys some rather powerful assumptions. One assumption is that civilizations are like individual beings, individual humans, and they go through the same kinds of stages. And also, it seems to assume that we actually have some way to know where we are on that growth chart. And of course, since we're the only civilization we know anything about, and we're a collection of civilizations, not a civilization, I don't think we really know all that much about the growth chart. So I call this the Star Trek imaginary, and I basically argue that in the Star Trek universe, advanced civilizations are unified, conflict within those civilizations is limited and controlled, and the course of cultural evolution basically has two outcomes. It leads towards unity or it ends badly. It's this binary, and there isn't much in between. And you can find this in other things, not just Star Trek. You find it in things like, Carl Sagan's Contact and other places. And I think these assumptions are rather spurious. For one thing, the idea that cultural or moral and technological progress somehow go hand in hand is quite dubious. Progress is a concept. It's not just a thing. It's something that's conceptualized within a particular cultural context, and it means different things in different places and in different ways. And when we look at this, so for example, we only have one data point to go with. That's human history, and that certainly does not unambiguously support the idea that cultural and moral development go along with technological development. And all you have to do is look at the 20th century, and you can see mountains of technological development. It's, I think, reasonably questionable just exactly how far we've come from a moral perspective, as say compared to Romans or anybody else. This idea of an evolutionary adolescence that Roddenberry thinks is something that's associated with, civilizations they go through, and then they somehow live for a long time if they get past that. And this idea that there's a lot that we can learn from these more advanced civilizations is, again, also, I think, open to a lot of question. Yeah, we might learn a lot from these civilizations. We might learn that the best way to keep going indefinitely is to vaporize other civilizations. I mean, who knows what we would learn from them? But to assume that it's just all positive and that progress is positive, that's a very Western perspective on things. The idea that progress is a good thing, that it leads to good places, that's ethnocentric. And so that's a big part of what I think is floating around in this kind of imaginary. So the main points that I get across in the presentation are, first, that the Star Trek imaginary within SETI is part of a social practice, and it's a moral discourse. And it's very important to think of it as a moral discourse. that shapes ideation and guides the ways in which SETI scientists justify their activities on moral grounds. The outcome of SETI is knowledge that has the potential to offer salvation to a civilization in distress, us, by offering the potential of learning from superior beings who have already achieved utopia. This, as I've written in other places, has a lot of similarities with cargo cults. So in short, there's a habituated practice of justification and legitimization in which SETI scientists engage in a kind of grounded, and they're engaged and grounded in a social imaginary that's juxtaposed against the social reality that those scientists observe around them. This is very common with the construction of an imaginary. The imaginary is the way we'd like things to be, not necessarily the way things are. And what they see is a reality of conflict and imminent danger associated with the trials and tribulations of civilizational adolescence. And so ET got past that, so maybe they can teach us something. So this particular social imaginary draws on and shares themes found in Star Trek universe. And they organize sort of culture and the idea of cultural change around the imaginings of a future that's directed toward kind of moral and actual physical salvation for us through the kind of evolutionary progress that's connected to the idea of cultural evolution. And of course, that the idea of evolution as progress is a problem anyway, whether we're talking about it biologically or talking about it with culture, but that's another whole issue. So that's basically what I was getting at in the presentation, and I can open it up for questions.
Okay, John, I'm going to abuse my moderator's role and actually ask a question because I'm just dying to ask this. And it might be very impolitic, but people who know me know that that never has any effect on me whatsoever. So look, in defense of Morgan, it seems like the kinds of things he identified are probably legitimate, an evolutionary biologist would say major transitions, right? So, people oftentimes identify the development of multicellularity as a major transition in evolution because it enables all kinds of new body plans that weren't possible before. So, he talks about basically tools, agriculture, and writing, all of which look like pretty good possibilities there. There are others that we may not have encountered yet, like the singularity, et cetera, et cetera. Whether or not they're progress is a whole nother question, though, if you imagine a world in which there's all kinds of ETIs and the vast majority of them seem to take a fairly similar trajectory, which despite differences in details, all pass through certain kinds of major transition points. Let's suppose that's true. And suppose these are three of the early ones. To what extent can you get some interesting insight into how these things are supposed to go, quote unquote, by talking about that?
Well, the problem with Morgan isn't, it may well be the case that the stages, the levels or whatever he's identified from a perspective of technological development makes sense, and those are transition points. That seems fine. The problem is there's no necessary attachment to moral or social development, which is what he does. He takes them and then he clearly creates a structure in which the modern Europeans and Americans of his time are more advanced. They're superior to the people who are living in a hunter-gatherer society. And the problem with that is, aside from the obvious racism that's floating around in typical 19th century ways of looking at things, but the other problem is that it depends on how you determine superior. So if you ask a question like, we, for example, I think we might say, most of us would say, egalitarianism is a sign of an advanced social structure. Well, if you want to look at the societies that were most egalitarian in human history, go and look at hunter-gatherers. Don't look at societies like ours, because ours isn't. And so the ones that are quote unquote primitive are in fact the ones that have the most advanced quality when it comes to that one, if we pick that as the one that we want to highlight as the thing that identifies this. So I think my point basically is that we can certainly talk about progress when we look at things like technological innovation, but when you attach value to that, that's a different issue. Progress in this case is just change. Technology improves in the sense that it can do more things. But when we talk about social organization, I think we're really just talking about change. I don't think it's evident that we're getting better over time. I think we just keep seeing the pieces getting rearranged and reorganized. So I wouldn't argue that our society is better than a society from 1,000 years ago or 5,000 or 10,000 years ago. It's just different. And so I think that actually what that does, though, is it generates in many SETI scientists this kind of tacit assumption that ET is going to be better than us. And that's a mistake. They may just be different from us.
Okay, Lucas?
I'm going to say, obviously, things about this tomorrow, but I loved the talk. Two questions, hopefully sort of fact-oriented. One, to what extent is Morgan drawing on Comte's three-part dichotomy in the evolution of civilizations? And two, to what extent do you think trekkers are drawing on actual biological or natural concepts of evolution? And to what extent is this just the word evolution thrown in to mean things getting better?
Okay, so the answer to question number one is I don't have a clue. I really don't know. The answer to number two, I think, is actually, I think you're probably pointing at something that's important here, is that it's perhaps often what's drawn on is a sort of the popular concept of evolution as opposed to the way biologists think about this. And I actually find this kind of interesting that it's floating around in the community of SETI scientists. Because when you think about biological evolution, it's just rearranging the pieces. That's what's going on. Things change, but it isn't that one organism is better than another organism. It's just adapted effectively for the environment it's in. And when that stops, it goes away. And so, but when you hear SETI scientists often talk about cultural evolution, they seem to see it in terms of progress, betterment, improvement. And that just intrigues me because that's not what's going on when we talk about biological evolution. And so I don't know why the disconnect is there, except that I think, Lucas, you get right to the point. The definition of evolution is when it's coming out of that kind of popular imaginary as opposed to the scientific imaginary. Which then, if you think about that, that really presents some real problems for SETI as a science if it's drawing on one of its key themes from a popular imaginary instead of drawing it out of scientific discourse. So that's a really great point. Thank you.
Okay, Sherry?
There we go. So I'm hyper, given the last couple talks, I'm hyper aware of what kind of question I'm about to ask. I'm hoping it's not what, anyway. So what I want to ask you, John, about, I love this paper, and it's something I've been struggling with, and I want to ask you about progress and how to measure it, because although I can think of a million ways in which humankind really sucks and we're doing bad things and we're terrible, there is absolutely no way a couple generations ago that I, as a disabled woman, would be part of any kind of higher education. I'd be lucky to be literate. So I feel like progress is being made, but then I also feel like obviously it isn't. And I want to separate technology from moral and ethical progress, but I want to know if you have any idea how to measure moral and ethical progress. What would we count? What kind of beans would we count?
Well, so no, I have no idea how to measure that.
Damn it.
Partly because I don't actually think it exists. And I know that's not a really popular perspective, but and the reason I don't think it exists is because fundamentally I'm a moral relativist. I think what's going on, I've subscribed particularly to the work of Richard Rorty, and his ideas are that basically, you know, that what's right and wrong is basically what people decide is right and wrong. So I don't think there are any absolutes in that. So if as a disabled person, you are living in an environment where you have far more opportunity today than you would have, 100 years ago, and that's clearly the case. I see that as different from being 100 years ago. Also, because of my cultural context, I see it as better. But I think that's where the measure comes from. The measure is in the context that decides what's better and worse, as opposed to an objective measure that says, this is the better way to do things. And you see, we're making progress towards that ideal out there. So that's where I come from this as a, as an anthropologist who thinks about things like ethics and moral structures in different societies. I really see them as, I basically see all concepts of right and wrong as being products of human culture and human innovation. And so I see that as an innovation that's developed, and it's a rearranging of the pieces. And because of where I come from, I think that's a better way of arranging the pieces. That's how I would look at that, Sherry. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and could you do something about less suffering, less, like and you wouldn't want to necessarily say that just living longer is better, because maybe that's not, but less suffering, less, if you could quantify suffering somehow, I feel like if you could ever count that, that might be the way to go. Fewer lives ending in violence, fewer lives ending in deprivation and starvation. I don't know.
I certainly would rather see the world be that way. But I don't know how I don't know how you really quantify or measure suffering, because some of that also depends upon the context you're in and
Right.
what is identified as suffering in a particular context. And so, I don't know, is a Zen monk who goes and sits in a cave and stares at a wall for 20 years until his arms and legs fall off, is he suffering?
Yeah, I don't know.
It depends. And so I think that's part of the problem, is that so many of these value things, well, all of them, they're defined by the cultural context. They're, maybe for me, to kind of get at your point, Sherry, is that the real way to address those kinds of issues is for humans to take ownership of them instead of thinking they're objective things, and say, we can decide how we want to make the world. And if we do that, then we can actually take ownership and do something. But
so that would be progress, right? Wouldn't that be progress if, like, you see a civilization that has decided what the hell to do instead of just letting everything happen?
Well, you see, I would just see that as different.
Okay, fair. Huh.
Okay, Linda?
Sorry, unmute. Love your paper, John, of course.
Thank you.
And I'm glad you're talking about progress as a concept, not a thing, because I've actually been deeply interested in the way that the idea of progress plays out, particularly in Western cultures, and how it's embedded in the theories of political economy that are dominant in Western cultures. It's a deeply Christian concept, progress. And I think a lot of people who call themselves capitalists or neoliberals or libertarians don't really think about the Christian origins of the concept or the Christian roots of that concept. And I do agree with you that progress is just change. And it's bothered me for a long, long time that particularly in American culture, we seem to be obsessed with the idea of technological progress being a necessity. I don't think it's a necessity. In a way, you could say that technological progress is simply change. And I was deeply disturbed at how crazy the Obama administration went over the idea of innovation, that innovation is like our #1 priority and we have to innovate, innovate, innovate. Well, what does that really mean? It's just, again, you can also say that innovation simply means change. So I could talk about this forever, but I'll stop. Thanks, John.
Well, yeah, I actually, the pointing out of the emphasis of Christianity is very important. That's one of the reasons I use the term eschatology in relation to this, is because it mirrors or reflects a kind of Eurocentric, Christocentric view of end things, and that somehow we're going to be all saved by this whatever this is that happens at the end. It's actually interesting when you said, innovation and change. It actually got me thinking about my other world that I live in. I'm a jazz musician, and when we talk about, most people wouldn't have any reason to know this, but jazz musicians don't write music the way other musicians do. We use what are called lead sheets, which basically give the melody and they give the chord structure, and then we improvise off of that. But we don't call the the process of going through the chords progress. We call that the changes. That's what you refer to when you read a lead sheet and you read the chord structures. They're just called the changes. And there's a lot of innovation that goes on in the improvisational process as you go through a tune. But they're just the changes. They're not leading to something better, worse. It's just rearranging things in new ways. That's what improvisation is about. That's actually what I think human society and culture is about. And I've actually written about that. I think it works very much the way that jazz music works in terms of your kind of, the rules out there are the cultural parameters, they're the lead sheet. And then what we do is we improvise off the changes. That's how we function in society. But it's this constant improvisational process that's going on rather than it's not a directional thing. It's not leading anywhere. And in jazz, it's not leading. It's just change.
Okay,